It was the autumn of 1944, deep in the heart of a Europe reshaped by war, when whispers began to move through German units stationed along the Western Front. The air was cold, carrying with it the metallic scent of spent shells and the dampness of permanently churned earth. Forests stripped bare by artillery shook under the distant thunder of tanks, and every so often, the low hum of aircraft vibrated through the soil like an omen. Soldiers huddled in their trenches, trading rumors the way desperate men cling to scraps of certainty. Some spoke of the British soldiers they expected to meet in battle, small, underfed, exhausted from years of bombardment and rationing. A worn-out empire, they thought. Troops with tired rifles and weaker bodies. An opponent easy to intimidate, easy to dismiss. But as German units were pushed back and collapse loomed, more prisoners of war were captured by the advancing Allied forces, and something unexpected began to circulate back through German ranks. Something that sparked disbelief, nervous laughter, and eventually a quiet, unsettled fear. For in the Piwadu camps, across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German soldiers who were captured and processed by the British began reporting something astonishing. The British were not weak. The British were not wary. The British, according to those who had seen them up close, were enormous. Towering men with broad shoulders, thick coats, and the calm confidence of soldiers who had endured everything and still stood unbroken. And on a cold morning inside a muddy transit camp not far from Chain, a group of captured Germans stood motionless, eyes widened, staring at the men who now guarded them, unable to understand how the enemy they underestimated had become a wall of giants. The shock did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back in small, tense increments, revealing a truth the German prisoners were never prepared to confront. It began the moment they were marched along the narrow dirt path leading toward the makeshift British camp. Their boots squelched heavily in the soft, rain-soaked mud, each footstep a reminder of exhaustion that clung to them like a second skin. The smell of damp earth filled the air, that raw, heavy scent that comes only after continuous days of cold drizzle. Their clothing, stiff with dried sweat and stained with the dust of retreat, felt heavier with every step. The guards escorting them kept a steady pace, their rifles slung casually over shoulders, boots clicking with a rhythm that contrasted sharply against the Germans' wary dragging. No one spoke. The only sounds were the shifting of gear, the clatter of metal buckles, and the distant croak of crows circling above leafless branches like small, dark omens. As they approached the entrance to the camp, the sight of the gate, nothing more than rough wooden beams, lashed together with rope, did little to ease their growing nervousness. Barbed wire curled around the perimeter in long, rusted spirals, glistening faintly with droplets of rain. A single lantern hung above the gateway, its weak glow flickering in the cold wind like a dying heartbeat. The Germans shuffled forward, chilled not just by the cold, but by the uncertainty of what awaited them inside. Many had imagined British camps to be small, disorganized, and poorly maintained. Depictions they had heard repeatedly through officers, through propaganda, through the carefully filtered stories meant to strengthen morale. But stepping closer, they began noticing subtle differences. The wooden towers flanking the entrance were sturdier than expected, each one manned by a guard who stood motionless, scanning the horizon with the disciplined stillness of a man accustomed to vigilance. There were no signs of disorder, no careless movements, no lingering unpreparedness. Instead, there was an eerie sense of control. A camp that had not been thrown together by desperation, but maintained through routine, structure, and unspoken authority. As the prisoners drew nearer, the British guards at the entrance came fully into view. At first, the Germans saw only the outlines of figures, tall silhouettes carved sharply against the pale morning fog. But as the mist shifted and thinned, the details sharpened. The men standing watch were noticeably taller, noticeably broader, noticeably stronger looking than the Germans had ever imagined British soldiers to be. And instinctively, the German column slowed. It wasn't hesitation dictated by command. It was a moment of involuntary disbelief. The guards seemed to stand a head taller than almost every man in the German line. Their shoulders filled their heavy wool greatcoats in a way that made the thick fabric look almost tailored. The coats hung past their knees, swaying slightly in the cold wind, but even the bulky layers couldn't hide the muscular outline beneath. Helmets sat firmly on their heads, shadowing stern, weather-hardened faces. Their jawlines were sharp, their eyes sharp as winter steel. These were not the frail, underfed, soft-edged troops German propaganda had painted. These were men built like battlements. The first German prisoner in line, a former machinist from Hamburg named Klaus, felt his breath catch. He had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, had seen Soviet soldiers who towered like pine trees, and yet something about these British guards unnerved him more deeply. It wasn't just their height. It was the way they carried themselves. A calm, controlled posture, chin slightly lifted, hands steady on their rifles. They did not look uncertain. They did not look fatigued. They looked like men who believed firmly that they were exactly where they were meant to be. As the group approached the gate, a British guard lifted one gloved hand and motioned for them to halt. His voice when he spoke was deep, clipped, and carried easily through the cold air. The Germans froze, their boots sinking slightly deeper into the mud as they obeyed. For a moment there was no movement, no sound, only the sharp contrast between two armies, one standing tall, firm, and unwavering, the other worn down, defeated, and bracing for whatever would come next. A sudden gust of wind swept across the camp, rattling the barbed wire and sending a chill through the prisoners' already cold bones. The smell of burning firewood drifted faintly from somewhere deeper within the camp, mixed with the scent of boiled tea and the smoke of damp logs struggling to burn. The sound of distant footsteps echoed, steady, heavy, authoritative, and it was then that another British guard emerged from behind the gate. He was even taller than the first, his greatcoat broad across the chest, his gloves creaking as he adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. When he lifted his head and met the eyes of the prisoners, several of them involuntarily straightened their backs. The Germans had marched through many checkpoints, seen many uniformed guards, endured countless inspections. But these men, these towering British soldiers, carried an aura entirely different from what they had expected. The PWs exchanged confused glances, each man silently questioning the same thing. Had they been lied to? Had everything they'd been told about the British been wrong? The guards stepped aside and signaled the prisoners to enter. One by one, the Germans passed beneath the gate's rough wooden frame, the lantern swaying above them with each gust of wind. Inside the camp, the ground was even muddier, churned up by boots and wheels, but the orderliness of the space was unmistakable. Barrels were stacked neatly against the fence, tents arranged in straight rows, wooden platforms raised to keep supplies dry. Smoke rose from a long trench of fires where kettles rested, steaming steadily. Then they saw them. More British soldiers gathered inside the central yard. Tall figures, every one of them. Their silhouettes, framed by white morning fog, appeared almost unreal, as if shaped by some artistic exaggeration rather than flesh and bone. One guard leaned casually against a post, his arms crossed, and even relaxed, his presence felt looming. Another, standing with hands behind his back, seemed to tower over the German prisoners by several inches. A third strode across the yard with long, heavy steps that left deep prints in the mud. The Germans whispered without meaning to. Their voices were hushed, strained, filled with confusion and quiet fear. They're giants. Someone muttered under his breath. I didn't know they were so tall. Another replied softly. This isn't what we were told. Their words drifted in fragments, barely audible, but the sentiment was shared by all. The British soldiers looked like men carved from stone and cold weather. Strong, disciplined, almost elemental. Nothing about them matched the image the German army had painted for its troops. Nothing resembled the small, wary, bomb-shaken soldiers they had been promised would crumble easily. One British guard stepped closer, stopping only a few feet from the prisoners. The leather strap of his rifle creaked softly as he shifted his weight. His greatcoat moved subtly in the wind, revealing the solid outline of his uniform beneath. His breath formed faint clouds in the cold air as he spoke, issuing clear, firm instructions to the escorting guards. The Germans stood rigid, almost instinctively falling into a more formal posture. Their training, their discipline, their pride, all flickered momentarily in an attempt to steady themselves. But the truth had already settled deep within them. The enemy standing before them was far more formidable than they had imagined. The physical presence of these men, the calm authority in their stance, the quiet discipline in their movements, all of it formed a silent challenge that weighed heavily on the minds of the defeated. For the first time since their capture, the German prisoners truly felt the scale of the mistake their commanders had made. They had underestimated the British. They had believed the stories painted for them, believed the illusions crafted to strengthen their resolve. But illusions crumble quickly in the face of reality, and here, inside this muddy camp, reality stood tall, broad-shouldered, and endlessly watchful. The prisoners were directed toward the center yard, passing close enough to the British guards to fully comprehend the difference in height, strength, and presence. One German soldier, a man known in his unit for being exceptionally tall, found himself walking beside a British guard who still surpassed him, both in stature and in sheer physical mass. The German's eyes widened as they took in details, the thick wool collars brushing against strong jawlines, gloves wrapped tightly around powerful hands, the unshaken firmness in every British soldier's posture. Mud clung to the Germans' boots like a heavy burden, but the British moved across the same ground with controlled ease. Their steps were confident, their faces calm, their breath steady. The Germans reached the yard, and for a brief moment, silence enveloped the space. A cold wind drifted through, tugging at the edges of coats, rustling the wire fences, carrying with it a sense of finality. The realization that they had entered a world far different from what they imagined. And there, surrounded by towering figures, humbled by reality, they experienced the first true shock of captivity. The enemy they thought weak was, in every visible way, a force of giants. The real escalation began the following morning, long before the sun had fully risen. when the prisoners were ordered into formation for the daily inspection. The camp was still wrapped in the pale grey hush of dawn, that fragile hour when the world feels half asleep and every sound seems magnified. Frost coated the ground in a thin, glittering layer, crunching sharply under boots as the German prisoners were herded out of their tents. Their breath fogged the air in shallow bursts, the cold biting into their cheeks and fingers. The smell of damp canvas, boiled oats, and lingering smoke drifted lazily through the stillness. A distant kettle clanged metal on metal, and somewhere on the far side of the camp a dog barked once, then fell silent again. The Germans shivered, not only from the cold but from the tense uncertainty of what awaited them. They stood in uneven lines at first, hunched from a night spent on thin bedrolls atop hard ground. Some rubbed their arms for warmth, others kept their eyes low, shoulders drawn inward. The camp had not yet fully awakened. Only the quiet shuffle of feet, the whisper of wind slipping through wires, and the occasional cough broke the early morning quiet. Then, from the direction of the central barrack, came the sound that would mark the beginning of a moment none of the prisoners would forget. A single, heavy bootstep, followed by another and another. Slow, controlled, powerful. The German prisoners lifted their heads instinctively, drawn by the weight of the sound. Through the mist, a figure began to emerge, tall, broad, unmistakably authoritative. The silhouette grew clearer with each step, taking shape against the pale morning light like some massive sculpture carved out of shadow and cold air. It was a British sergeant, and he was enormous. He wore a thick wool greatcoat that stretched wide across his chest and shoulders, the kind of garment that looked heavy even from a distance. Yet he moved with a natural ease, as if the weight meant nothing. His boots pressed deeply into the frost, hardened soil with each step, leaving sharp, defined impressions behind him. His gloved hands were clasped calmly behind his back. His helmet sat low on his forehead, casting a stern shadow over piercing eyes that seemed to cut through the line of prisoners even before he reached them. The Germans straightened at once, almost reflexively, as though the sheer presence of the man demanded it. Some exchanged quick glances, nervous, confused, intimidated. Others stared ahead stiffly, trying not to reveal their own discomfort. But the closer the sergeant came, the more undeniable his dominance became. His height alone made several prisoners shift uneasily. His shoulders looked as if they could bear the weight of an entire supply crate without effort. Even his footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, sounded like a warning carved into the frozen ground. He stopped a few feet away, allowing his imposing figure to settle fully into their line of sight. The Germans felt it, the way his presence altered the air, thickening it with expectation. There was no need for him to speak yet. The simple act of standing before them was enough to silence every nervous whisper. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he began walking down the line. Each step beside the prisoners felt like a judgment, not spoken, not written, but carried in the firmness of his stride. His eyes scanned each face with unwavering focus, not hurried, not impatient. It was the look of a man who understood authority deeply, who had enforced discipline long before this war, long before these prisoners had ever held rifles in their hands. As he neared the middle of the formation, the Germans felt their tension heighten. Their breath came shorter, their feet pressed harder into the frost, and their bodies straightened as if responding to an instinct older than the war itself. Authority was not spoken, it was felt, and this man radiated it effortlessly. Then came the moment none of them had expected. The moment that would echo through the camp long after the inspection ended. The sergeant paused. He had stopped in front of one specific prisoner, the tallest German among them. A man named Rudolf Weber, known in his unit as Der Bar, the bear for his size, strength and physical endurance. He had been a factory worker before the war, lifting metal beams and crates with ease. Even among fellow soldiers he had stood out, broad-backed, thick-armed, a man whose presence filled a room. And yet, standing before the British sergeant, Rudolf suddenly looked much less like a bear and much more like an ordinary man. The sergeant, easily taller by several inches, loomed over him with a calm but iron-like command. His posture did not change, his face did not shift, his voice did not yet speak. But the air between them tightened, and every prisoner in the line felt the weight of the comparison. The myth of German physical superiority, so heavily emphasized in propaganda, so deeply embedded into many soldiers' sense of identity, cracked visibly in that single moment. Rudolf swallowed hard. His jaw clenched. His eyes briefly flicked upward to meet the sergeant's stare. But the British giant did not blink, did not step back, did not acknowledge any challenge. He simply stood, unbothered, unthreatened, like a mountain of cold discipline, staring down a man who suddenly felt smaller than he had ever felt before. That image alone rippled through the entire formation. Some prisoners looked down at their boots. Some blinked fast, realizing the lie they had been taught. Some felt a deep, unsettling drop in their stomachs, not from fear, but from recognition. The sergeant finally broke the silence. His voice was deep, steady, and carried the calm certainty of a man who had weathered storms far harsher than this. He spoke to the British guards nearby, issuing brief, clipped instructions. The Germans didn't understand every word, but they understood enough to know that he was in control, that he was respected, that his authority felt natural, not forced. When he resumed walking, the Germans followed him with their eyes, taking in every detail: the broad steps, the disciplined posture, the way his coat moved with his stride. He inspected the rest of the line with the same methodical scrutiny. No one dared shift. No one dared speak. Even the camp itself seemed to fall quiet around him, as though the world briefly respected his command. More guards soon joined him, equally tall, equally imposing. They stood in a loose half-circle near the formation, discussing logistical notes and patrol rotations. To the Germans, they looked like a line of massive statues come to life, each one shaped by years of wartime endurance, hard labor, and relentless training. Their long shadows stretched across the frost-covered yard, cutting through the cold morning like dark pillars. The prisoners could feel their own inferiority settle into their bones. These British soldiers were not the weak, bomb-shaken, starving shadows that German officers had described. They were not the frail bodies of an empire supposedly on its last legs. Here they stood, tall, unbroken, physically powerful, mentally composed. And that sight alone shifted something deep within the prisoners' morale. Some Germans felt embarrassment. Some felt admiration they couldn't admit aloud. Some felt fear, not of violence, but of truth. As the inspection continued, one British guard walked past the prisoners while carrying a heavy wooden crate on his shoulder. The crate looked full, probably food rations or ammunition. The man carried it effortlessly, the muscles in his arm flexing beneath the thick coat. His pace did not slow, his breath did not strain. The Germans watched silently, none daring to meet his eye as he passed. The sight reinforced the growing realization. These men were strong, unusually strong, and their calm confidence made it even more unsettling. The inspection lasted nearly an hour, though to the prisoners it felt like far longer. Every second spent under the towering presence of the British guards deepened the psychological weight. When at last the sergeant signaled that the inspection was complete, a quiet shudder of relief passed through the line. Shoulders loosened. Chests rose with more natural breath. The tension that had wrapped around their spines began to unwind, though not fully, not yet. For even as they were dismissed, even as they were led away to continue the routines of captivity, the truth followed them like a shadow. They could not shake. The British were nothing like they had been told. They were giants, not only in height, but in discipline, in resolve, in the quiet strength that could not be faked or exaggerated. And for the German prisoners, that moment marked the beginning of a new understanding, a new respect, and a new fear. They had underestimated their enemy, and now, face to face with towering proof, the consequences of that mistake felt very, very real. The true climax of their shock came not during formation, not during roll call, and not during any moment where discipline demanded rigid posture and controlled expressions. No, the moment that struck deepest, the moment that carved itself into the memory of every German prisoner, came unexpectedly in the mess area. It was a place that should have been ordinary, mundane, almost comforting in its simplicity. Food distribution, after all, was not a battlefield, not a show of authority, not a demonstration of military strength. It was routine, the same in every camp, on every front, in every army. But in this British camp, even routine carried weight. The mess area was a large rectangular space surrounded by rough wooden planks hammered together to form a crude half-shelter. Smoke drifted lazily upward from several long metal stoves, curling into faint spirals that danced in the cold air before vanishing into the grey sky. The ground was thick with mud, churned by boots and wagon wheels, and littered with shallow puddles that reflected the pale light of a sun struggling to break through the clouds. The scent of porridge, bland, warm, but undeniably comforting to hungry stomachs, mixed with the sharper smell of soot and wet wood. The German prisoners were led into the area in small groups, their tin bowls clutched between trembling fingers. Many had slept poorly, haunted by the images of the towering British soldiers who had inspected them earlier. Whispers from the previous day had not faded. If anything, they had grown heavier, more vivid, more unsettling. Even now, as they stood waiting for their turn in the food line, their eyes darted across the yard, instinctively searching for the giants they had encountered. And soon enough, they saw them. The British soldiers were moving about the mess area, not slowly, not carelessly, but with a steady rhythm that spoke of efficiency honed through harsh winters, endless marches, and relentless wartime pressure. One soldier approached carrying a large wooden crate loaded with tins of condensed milk. The crate was so heavy that 2 German prisoners would have struggled to lift it together. Yet the British soldier held it against his hip with only one hand, balancing it effortlessly as he walked. His other hand carried a large ladle. His boots sank into the mud, but his stride never faltered. The Germans watched in stunned silence. Another guard was rolling a thick water barrel across the yard. The barrel's wooden frame creaked loudly as it moved, sloshing with gallons of icy water. But the guard, tall enough that his shadow cast over half the yard, seemed unmoved by the weight. He gripped the handles with powerful hands, thick fingers tightening around the cold iron. His arm muscles shifted beneath his coat, visible even through the heavy wool. He pushed the barrel up a slight incline without struggle, without strain, without even pausing to catch his breath. A murmur rippled through the German prisoners standing nearby. How is he doing that? Is he really that strong? Are all of them built like this? Before the whispers could settle, yet another British soldier emerged from behind one of the stoves. He carried a cast iron pot so enormous it looked almost comical in scale. A pot so wide it could have fed 40 men at once. Steam wafted from the lid, the scent of boiled oats drifting with it. The soldier lifted the pot from the fire, gripping it firmly with two thick mitts. Even with the heat radiating from its metal surface, even with the weight pulling downward, he raised it with a steady, practiced motion and set it onto her wooden platform without so much as a strained grunt. The German prisoners exchanged glances that held the same silent message: these men are unreal. But the shock did not end with the physical displays. What struck the Germans even more deeply was the expression on the British soldiers' faces, or rather, the lack of expression. There was no arrogance, no pride, no hostility, no self-satisfaction. They worked calmly, quietly, as if strength of this magnitude were normal, expected, unremarkable. As if carrying barrels, crates, and iron pots weighing half their own body weight was simply part of another day. To the Germans, however, it felt like witnessing the impossible. They began to move forward in line, bowls outstretched. The British server stationed behind the main pot was another towering figure, tall enough that standing directly in front of him felt like being in the shadow of a moving tree. His greatcoat hung open slightly, revealing a thick sweater underneath. His breath appeared in long, slow clouds as he ladled steaming porridge into the prisoners' bowls with the ease of a man who could probably have lifted the entire pot with both hands if ordered to. The prisoners mumbled quiet, danky, out of habit, unsure whether to say something in English. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others lifted their eyes briefly, only to drop them again when they realized how far upward they needed to look. Rudolf Weber, the same tall German who had been dwarfed during the inspection, approached the British server. He stood nearly 6 feet 2, a height that usually placed him at the top of any formation. Yet standing before this British guard, he felt reduced once more to the uncomfortable truth he could no longer ignore. The guard looked down, not sharply, not coldly, but simply due to their natural height difference. A polite, subtle nod was offered. That was all, but even this simple exchange felt like a reversal of everything Rudolf had believed. He stepped away slowly, cradling his food, the realization burning in his chest: strength doesn't lie. Eyes don't lie. Presence doesn't lie. The Germans sat together on long wooden benches that lined the inside of the mess shelter. The wind whistled through cracks in the planks, carrying with it the distant sounds of British conversation. Low voices, calm footsteps, the clack of metal on wood. The prisoners ate in silence at first, but conversations soon began to sprout in hushed fragments. You saw the one with the crate, didn't you? He held it like it was nothing. The sergeant. I swear he's 7 feet tall. These men, they're not what we were told. No. Not at all. The longer the prisoners watched the British move, the more their understanding dissolved. The enemy they believed to be physically weak, morally crumbling, and materially worn down was none of those things. Instead, the British seemed carved from endurance, shaped by years of hardship. held together by unbroken resolve. Even their smallest tasks radiated quiet confidence. But it wasn't only the British strength that shocked them. It was the British calm. Even in a Padaub camp filled with enemy soldiers, the guards did not bark commands unnecessarily. They did not flaunt power. Their discipline was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, consistent, almost serene, and that serenity carried far more weight than any shouted order or forced display of dominance. German soldiers were trained to read people, to assess enemy resolve, to measure the morale of opposing forces, to predict whether a unit might break. But here, in the mess area, surrounded by British soldiers moving with casual strength and unwavering calm, the Germans sensed something profoundly unsettling. These men will not break. Even defeated, even hungry, even exhausted. A soldier carries himself differently when he believes in the strength of his own force. And the British radiated that strength in every motion, every step, every effortless lifting of weight. As the Germans finished their meal, they looked around at the yard with new eyes. One soldier leaned toward his friend and whispered, "I understand now why our lines fell. It wasn't just their guns." Another nodded slowly. It was them. The realization spread through the prisoners like cold water. Their commanders had underestimated these men. Their propaganda had lied. Their confidence had been misplaced. And now, in captivity, they were seeing the truth with painful clarity. The British were not weak. The British were not soft. The British were not crumbling. They were strong, in body, in presence, in spirit. And the Germans, sitting with empty bowls and uneasy hearts, felt the psychological weight of this discovery settle over them like a winter blanket. A weight heavier than any chain, heavier than defeat, heavier than fear. For the first time, they understood the real power behind the Allied advance. Not just equipment, not just numbers, but men. Men built like giants, men who moved through hardship like it was nothing, men who represented a nation that refused to break. That understanding lingered long after breakfast was over, long after the prisoners were led back to their barracks, long after the sun rose higher in the sky, and it stayed with them for the rest of their captivity. The undeniable truth that their enemy, whom they once dismissed, had proven himself in the most human, undeniable way possible.